You may think of knights as having a hulking He-Man physique, but upon closer examination, they look more like what some may nowadays call twinkish. Whoa, chill. I'm not saying that knights were scrawny weaklings. What I am saying is that their diet and form of exercise was more conducive to building strength rather than mass. And before the actually brigade rolls in going, well, you can't actually increase muscle strength without increasing muscle size, there's a reason why exercise regimens are tailored to specific goals. You know, is your main focus trying to build as much mass as possible, or is your main focus trying to get as strong as possible, or is it something in between? And even when it comes to strength, there are different types. There's explosive strength, there's muscle endurance, etc., etc. I'll leave the finer points to the actual fitness experts. Nobody believes an out-of-shape nerd talking about fitness anyway, understandably. Obviously, knights did plenty of rigorous training, sword practice, jousting, wrestling, swimming, running in armor. A particular French knight by the name of Jean Le Mangre, this pronunciation I might have mangered a little bit, talks about jumping onto a horse, rock climbing, and even climbing the underside of a ladder using just the arms, all in full armor. That would be rather strenuous, as you can imagine. Now, just because one guy said it doesn't mean everybody did it. People love to jump to conclusions, always take one snippet of information, run with it, and just go, oh yeah, this and that always happened. No, chill. We should never disregard the significance of individual difference. That goes for practice, and it also goes for genetics, which of course are important for this kind of thing. Because one guy may have the genetics to be, without any kind of training, bigger than another guy who trains a lot. All that being said, in general, it seems that artists, whether it be for fantasy or historical fiction, have this conception that mother's milk contains steroids, and all the dudes are huge. Now, obviously, a suit of plate obscures the exact body shape, but they're still often portrayed in such a way to indicate that there's plenty of meat in that can. When I look at medieval depictions, I can't find a single bodybuilder, or any big guy, really. In fact, in a lot of these images, they look pretty skinny. In this bathing scene, you don't see rippling muscles everywhere. In fact, their physique is rather unremarkable, right? This is a tomb effigy from 1370, where a man is portrayed right next to a woman. And he doesn't look a whole lot bigger than she does, despite wearing armor. Like, we're talking several layers. We're talking plate, mail, and some kind of undergarment. And that's quite often the case, that knights in medieval paintings are portrayed as surprisingly slender even when they're wearing armor, which adds a significant amount of bulk. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. Well, you can't go by the pictures. They painted killer bunnies and knights fighting snails too. You're going to take that at face value? Well, hang on, we'll get to that. Of course, art is stylized, and it represents ideals more than reality. And in some cases, it's quite obvious. Like this stick figure knight from Hungary. He looks like he's just bone, skin, and armor. That's just the artist being weird, right? And speaking of ideals, there are, of course, written medieval sources that talk about how a man should be. For example, the Secretum Secretorum, which was written in Arabic in the 10th century and translated to Latin in the 12th century, describes the ideal physique as a broad chest and back, well-built shoulders, and long legs. They had a bit of a proto-phrenology thing going on, because it also says that short arms mean that someone is foolish, and slender feet means they're small-minded and ignorant. It also says that someone who speaks without moving his hands is of great wisdom and honesty. Now, strong shoulders and back make perfect sense for sword fighting in particular, and forearms as well. Those would also be well developed, generally. And a narrow waist is very commonly seen in these depictions. In fact, sometimes they're so narrow it's kind of scary. So that tells you that they valued low body fat. I mean, either valued it or just happened to have it due to their diet. I guess I'm sort of an anti-knight. Now when you hear well-developed shoulders, broad chest and back, you may very well think of bodybuilders. You know, boulder shoulders and massive pecs and all the lats. If most people are kind of slim, because they just don't eat the kinds of amounts that you need as a bodybuilder to really gain size, and particularly when even men are expected to have really slim waists, which clearly from these pictures they were, if you have a pretty strong V-taper, the chest and shoulders are going to look much bigger, of course. Like, that doesn't mean that they were huge overall, but, you know, well-developed physique still, and probably defined. They probably had six-pack abs and all that. You know, if you have a low body fat percentage, then, yeah, everything is going to look more muscular. And even though some of these pictures look like they skipped leg day or like everything day, what they didn't skip is calves. There's some pictures that show extremely developed calves, which makes sense because they walked a lot and they had different footwear. So a hypothesis is that they actually walked not on the heels, but on the balls of their feet. If you do that, especially when walking uphill, you'll definitely feel it in your calves. And of course, the stance in sword fighting is also on the balls of the feet. You don't necessarily have to lift the heels, but the weight is definitely on the balls of the feet, so you can shift back and forth and step quickly, you know, the same way as in many martial arts nowadays. So you may wave your hand at those historical images like, whatever, it's stylized, it didn't really look like that. Have you looked at the armor that they actually wore? If you walk through a museum and see a bunch of armor being displayed from the Middle Ages and Renaissance to an extent, they look exactly like that. Like, they have impossibly skinny waists and they're not huge overall. It's a bit harder to tell in a picture because you don't have a sense of size, like you're not standing right beside it, but you can still tell by the proportions. Like, there is no space for huge bodybuilder arms. There is no space to squeeze in boulder shoulders and a gigantic chest. By the way, let's quickly address the misconception of height. There's a study, which I'm going to link in the description below, that has found that the average male height in the Middle Ages wasn't much less than the average height nowadays. They found that the average height in the Middle Ages was 173.4 centimeters, which is about 5'6" or 7. When you look at these suits of armor in person, especially Gothic plate, and you just walk around it and you imagine what sort of person fits in there. Definitely not a bodybuilder. Bruce Lee would fit in there. You know, somebody who is strong and muscular but not big. Now in the Renaissance, you also see some armor made for chonkers. You know, like this armor for Henry VIII. Now, the way Henry VIII was built, you wouldn't exactly call bodybuilder, right? He just liked food. Ironically, even depictions of the fight between David and Goliath show Goliath as tall but skinny. I mean, look at this. You would depict Goliath as like massive, you know, tall but also super broad and packed with muscle. Speaking of David and Goliath, there's also a painting of remarkable artistic craftsmanship. There are of course also cases of actual gigantism in history. And remember what I said earlier about individual differences? I'm sure there were occasional knights who were exceptionally stout and muscular, but there is a very clear trend to be seen in medieval artwork and the dimensions of existing armor. Anyway, so much of this also applies to earlier times, to some extent, although it's worth mentioning that the ancient Greeks had high standards for athletic builds, at least when it comes to the ideal, the way it's portrayed in art, which would of course become a goal for men to chase after, the same way as nowadays, where everybody wants to look like Arnie, right? So generally I would say that the chance of encountering a warrior in real life history who was actually built like Boagrius in the movie Troy is slim to none. But this depiction of Heracles, or Hercules, is actually pretty similar to that build. I would assume that there were at least some exceptional individuals who managed to attain this goal and actually looked like that, because these statues are lifelike. So they knew what it looks like. And when you look at the way Roman gladiators were portrayed, they also had a lot more meat on them than the knights in medieval depictions. Which makes sense for them because they were basically the ancient Roman equivalent of pro wrestlers. A little bit more hazardous, but there was a lot of showmanship involved. Like, they were meant to put up a spectacle. So having particularly big, muscular, imposing physiques would help with that, would be more entertaining. All right, so the takeaway from all this is that Link is a perfect knight by medieval standards. And think about it. Well-developed shoulders, tiny waist relative to chest and shoulders, long legs. Link would have rescued a lot of princesses, if you know what I mean. You're welcome. Hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching. Check out my other videos as well.